Oh, I know that sound. It's time for the Beer News Report. Hi, and welcome to the Beer News Report. Cheers. This is the second part of the series of American Rebirth. In the first part, we talked about what the world was like before the U.S. started its policing policy right after World War II. America gave for free this policing policy if you sided with them on the Cold War against Russia. The effects were massive growth in global trade. But then the Cold War ended, and America was saying, why am I still policing the world? So I showed how America started to pull back, and the other countries are now beefing up their military because they have to still protect their interests. That brings us to today, and now we're going to talk about the effects of population. If your population is growing, then you're consuming more, and you should increase your global trade because it's very rare that a country can produce everything it needs to live. So this is an example of a population pyramid. This is the one for the United States, but for every country that I do, I will show you the population pyramid. This is what a population graph looks like. And what I'm going to do is put a dotted line where the current population is on each graph so that you'll have a reference point. So the way it's going to go is we got North American countries first, European countries, and then Asian countries. As you're watching this, remember that all the countries in the videos have trade agreements with each other. So you have a trade-based economy, you need to find a growing population to expand your trade and increase your GDP. For reference, America is a consumer-based economy, so trade isn't that important as it would be, say, for China or Germany. Those are trade-based countries. Okay, before I start, I want to give you a primer on population so you have a general understanding of its effects. It'll only take a couple minutes, and it's got pictures. That's fun. All right, cheers. Today we're going to talk about the effects of population. Usually we compare countries by their GDP, or gross domestic product. It is the measure of how much a country produces. For example, in 2018, the US had a GDP of 20.54 trillion, whereas China's GDP was 13.61 trillion. In the old days, when agriculture was the main industry, having a big family was necessary. Your kids would help you out in the fields. So in those days, China and India, which had the largest populations, they also had the biggest GDP because they produced the most food. Planting by hand was hard, so basically 1 man-hour equaled $1 worth of production. But by using animals, you could increase your production. So now 1 man-hour equaled $2 worth of production. Then came the Industrial Revolution and mass production. No longer were large families the rule of the land. Agricultural mechanization increased production even more. 1 man-hour equaled $10 worth of production. And with machines and conveyor belts, factories could produce even more. So 1 man-hour now is $100 worth of production. Today we have robots aiding in production, increasing efficiency even more. So now 1 man-hour equals $1,000 worth of production. So now the two key ingredients to high production are education and technology. Although you still need a population because the more educated people you have using the technology, the higher your GDP. For example, the US has a highly educated population, whereas China is getting there. Even though China has 4 times the population of the US, our GDP is higher because our population can produce more. In 2018, per person, the US produced $62,800, whereas China produced $9,800. Okay, a couple things about that clip. The production numbers are generalized, meaning it's to show that you can get more production out of a person by giving them the technology or educating them. The actual numbers are way different depending on the technology and the levels of education, but it's been clearly proven that by giving people tools and training, you can improve their production. Okay, cool. Let's get on to the first set. These are the North American countries. Of course, I'm starting here because my whole fan base is in America, and I don't want to keep you waiting. So it'll go like this. America first, then Canada, and then finally Mexico. Sound good? Cheers. This is the U.S. population pyramid. First thing you'll notice is the baby boomers. This is a huge group and they're going into retirement. But luckily, we have an even bigger group of millennials to take their place. But the best thing to notice is that the population as a whole doesn't change that much from the baby boomers on down as you will see in the upcoming population graph. Here's the US population graph, and it's showing slow but steady growth. That's what we'd expect from the population pyramid we just saw. As the baby boomers retire, the elderly population grows. That means all those 401ks and IRAs that we've been pumping money into, well, now we're going to take that money out. With all that stock selling happening, even in a good economy, there will be a strain on the stock market. The good news is we are producing an increasing amount of babies, which will keep our consumption needs strong and thus our economy strong. This is Canada's population pyramid, and it looks a lot like the US. But you get your baby boomers at the top, and they're retiring, and the millennials right below them. But the millennials aren't as many as the baby boomers. But there's another issue that we need to look at that'll show up in the population graph just coming up. This is Canada's population graph, and as you can see, it has slow and steady growth just like the US, but it has a low population. Canada's population is similar to that of California, so its military, relatively speaking, is small and can't really be aggressive. But why would you need an aggressive military? Well, you don't need one as long as the US is protecting the waters. But in my last show, I mentioned that the US is starting to pull out of its world policing policy. So expect Canada to maintain good relations with the US because friends of the US don't get attacked. Lastly, their healthcare system and the baby boomers retiring, expect that to be a huge strain on their economy. This is Mexico's population pyramid. Isn't this a thing of beauty? I mean, it's a classic pyramid of a high growth economy. And look at the size of their consumption group. This type of pyramid indicates that their economy should skyrocket. Let's see what the population graph tells us. This is Mexico's population graph. And look how steep, meaning fast, the growth is. This should continue for about 20 more years, but then the lack of babies will start to take effect. But it is a big market. Mexico's population is about half of the US. And such a young population will have high consumption needs and will be a prime trading partner for the US. So expect US businesses to invest in Mexico and to tap into this high consumption market. Also, Mexico has low wages, just like China. This will be another reason why US companies will want to build manufacturing plants there, especially since the relations between the US and China, they're kind of strained. Well, that looks pretty good for North America. All our populations are growing, so we can increase our trade with each other. Plus, by being close to each other, there's less shipping costs. Okay, on to Europe. These are the countries we will be looking at in this order: Germany, France, Italy, Spain, and the UK. Let's see how they're doing. Cheers. This is Germany's population pyramid. Look at their baby boomers. They have a lot of baby boomers going into retirement. The problem is the millennials aren't even close to replacing them. That means their population should tank, and when the population tanks, so does the GDP. Let's take a look at their population graph. Here's Germany's population graph. Their population is already shrinking and is going to continue. Do you remember when the Syrian war started and Germany said that it would take in 1 million refugees? Well, this is why. Germany needs working age people. On top of that, you have baby boomers retiring, which will put a strain on their healthcare system. Finally, with less people, there's less consumption, which will affect their trade. I'm pointing this out because I want to show a trend that's happening. This is France's population pyramid. It looks pretty level from the baby boomers all the way down. So let's see what their population graph shows. Here's France's population graph. This confirms what we saw in the population pyramid, that the workforce is flat. The only thing growing is their elderly population, and that is the effect of the baby boomers retiring. And it too will put a strain on their healthcare system. So for France, consumption and trade should remain stable. All right, France. Here's Italy's population pyramid. Their big population group is Gen X. Gen X is the generation between baby boomers and millennials. The only problem is they're the only big generation, and they're very close to retirement. Can you guess what their population graph will look like? Okay, here's Italy's population graph. Did you guess right? Italy's workforce is shrinking, and it'll continue to shrink, which means their GDP will shrink. To make matters worse, they have a huge debt load. So as their GDP shrinks, a larger percent of their GDP will go to interest payments. Then you have Gen X retiring, which adds increasing healthcare costs. This also affects their GDP. Finally, with less people, there's less consumption, which reduces global trade. Italy might be in trouble. Here's Spain's population pyramid. Looks a lot like Italy, right? Well, except their Gen X is younger. So we already know what the population graph is going to look like, right? All right, here's Spain's population graph. It's just like Italy's, except they're behind by about 10 years. Unfortunately, Spain is following in the footsteps of Italy. They have a shrinking workforce, which is going to shrink their GDP. They have high debt. Their Gen X is retiring. Less consumption means less global trade. So whatever Italy is doing to pull out of their problems, Spain can copy it. Or if that isn't working for Italy, they can do something different, and hopefully they can get out of their problems. Good luck, Spain. All right, here's the United Kingdom. Their population pyramid looks a lot like the US and Canada. They got the baby boomers retiring, but they got the millennials to replace them. Let's see what their population graph looks like. All right, here's the UK population graph. Not as strong as the US, but it is growing, so their GDP will grow. Now, I just showed you 4 of the countries in the EU, and France was the only one with the best growth, and it was flat. So if you're the Prime Minister of England and you saw these member countries going down the tubes, would you stay in the EU? Now you know why we have Brexit. Of course, you know why the EU is going to be hard on the UK, because they need them in the EU. All right, the question is, will there be an EU in 10 years? I don't know. Back to the UK, their baby boomers are also retiring, so of course this puts a strain on their healthcare system. But with more people comes more consumption and thus more trade. The good news is they are a strong ally of the US. All right, add another strong trading partner to our list. Well, unfortunately, the EU is not doing as good as North America. If you're wondering why France and Germany are staying in the EU, it's because they're the ones that started it. And you may be wondering, why don't I bring up Portugal or Greece? I wanted to stick with the bigger economies, and I didn't want it to look like I was beating a dead horse. I mean, Portugal's in the same boat as Italy and Spain, and Greece has already been hit by austerity measures from the EU. And you know, this is an interesting point. If you remember back in 2008 when the U.S. went through the financial crisis, and all the banks were saying, hey, you got to save us because we're too big to fail. And well, Greece did something similar to that. So they got hit with austerity measures, and nobody liked it. And years were going on, and everyone hated it. And they were having an election for prime minister, and one of the people running said, hey, I'm going to get rid of the austerity measures. So if you elect me, I'll get rid of the austerity measures. And people are like, well, great, you're elected. Put him in. So this guy gets elected. He goes to the EU, says, hey, I don't want the austerity measures. And they're like, well, we don't care. You're going to get them anyways. And he said, no, I'm going to let my country go bankrupt, and all those loans are just going to default, and you're going to lose everything. And Germany's like, whoa, wait a minute. We got hundreds of billions of dollars invested in you. You can't let these go bad. So they worked something out. Now, Greece still does have austerity measures, but it's lighter than what they were having. So the point is, you know how our banks are too big to fail? Well, Greece racked up enough debt that they have too much debt to fail. You can't let them fail. So it's going to be interesting to see how they pull themselves out of this mess. But, well, anyways, let's go on to Asia. Okay, it's going to go on in this order. We got China, Japan, Russia, India, and Pakistan. Hopefully they're doing better than the EU. Cheers. Here's China's population pyramid. China's baby boomers are actually older than the US, so more of them have retired. And their millennials aren't as big as the baby boomers. This is the effect of the one-child policy. Another effect of this policy is how many more men there are than women. Not that I'm a proponent of marriage, I'm single, but this should leave a lot of Chinese men frustrated. Let's check out their population graph. Here's China's population graph. You can see although their population is increasing, their workforce is decreasing. That's all the baby boomers going into retirement. Now look at the year 2100. By then, China's population will have decreased by 400 million. That's the entire population of the US in 2060, our future population. So that's 5 million people each year. So each year, they lose the equivalent population of Vermont, Wyoming, Alaska, North Dakota, South Dakota, and Delaware. So with a shrinking population, their GDP should go down, although they do have a very strong education program, so we'll see if that solves the problem. They will also have a huge elderly population, which is something new for them. It'll be interesting to see how their healthcare system handles it. Now, China is not a consumer market. They rely on global trade. But Europe is also shrinking, and they've pissed off the US by stealing our intellectual property. They have to find new markets, and that's why they're doing the Belt and Road Initiative. This is Japan's population pyramid. Japan has the world's oldest population. Their baby boomers have already retired. Their millennials are going into retirement. This looks a lot like Italy and Spain. Let's check out their population graph. Here's Japan's population graph, and we've seen this before. Japan's workforce will lose about 50 million people by 2100. So then, that should lower their GDP, but they are using robots to replace their workforce. Japan is the #1 producer of robots. Finally, they have a large elderly population, which, of course, puts pressure on their healthcare system. Here's Russia's population pyramid. At first glance, it doesn't look that bad until you learn that the retirement age is 60. It's 67 in the US. So their baby boomers have retired. Right now, their millennials are saving them. Let's take a look at their population graph. Here's Russia's population graph. You can see at the peak when the baby boomers started to retire. The millennials can't keep up, so their GDP is shrinking. Then their elderly population is growing, so you know what that means. Finally, this will cause their military to shrink. So whatever plans Russia has to lock down its national security, it has to do it now. That's why they are in the Ukraine, they took Crimea, and they're working with Syria. Watch how they build a defensive perimeter. Here's India's population pyramid, and it's just like Mexico, only 10 times bigger. India is built for growth, and look at the size of that consumption group. Its population graph should look awesome. Here's India's population graph. Their growing workforce is good until about 2040, and by then it'll be humongous, about 1 billion people. So their GDP should have strong growth. And with such a young workforce, their consumption should be incredible. Thus, they will be a high trade market. Here's Pakistan's population pyramid. Another high growth pyramid, about twice Mexico's, with a big consumption group, but obviously not as big as India's. Here's Pakistan's population graph, but take notice that their workforce peaks around 2070. So they have a much younger workforce. This means their GDP will be growing strong for decades. Finally, their elderly population doesn't really get that big until 2100. By that time, everyone has a high elderly population. So they can learn from other countries what works and what doesn't. Okay, so some countries were doing good, some not so good. It's interesting to see what they're focusing on. For example, China is focusing on trade. So it's doing this massive infrastructure project covering the whole world, well, half of the whole world, with a Belt and Road Initiative. Japan is focusing on technology. They're building a robotic workforce. Interesting note, China did this takeover of a German robotic company called KUKA. And when I was at Tesla, they had KUKA robots all over the place, and I'm sure most of the automobile manufacturers do. But I think Germany made a big mistake letting this technology go. I mean, I think it was a big win for China. As for Russia, well, so they're just setting up a defensive perimeter. They're using their military to kind of go into the countries bordering them and basically putting them under their control without really saying that, hey, you are under my control. So I guess they see a dark future. I hope they're wrong. Anyways, as for India and Pakistan, their economies are growing. All they have to do is just let it keep going and not shoot themselves in the foot. Well, you can see I'm at the end of my beer, and that means we're at the end of the show. I hope you liked it, and please click like if you did. Next week, I'm going to focus on what 3 things you need to make sure that you have a secure and stable future. Does America have these 3 things? You'll have to wait and see. Well, if you want to be notified of this upcoming show, just click that subscribe button and it'll let you know when I'm done. Till then, keep your beer cold and your interests hot. Cheers.